There is much to be thankful for on this day, too many things to really list, but modern conveniences and advances in technology are many things we take for granted. But nonetheless, we should take time to take stock and to recognize that many of these inventions were either invented or perfected here in the United States of America. And here in the U.S., we can also enjoy and appreciate gold and silver and own it freely. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution recognizes gold and silver as money. Over 400 times mentioned in the Bible, gold and silver indeed are referred to as God's money, recognized by the Constitution. So it's in that light that we can appreciate those things. But more importantly than all of those conveniences, technologies, and things, we have to look forward to and be thankful for is the human element. We should appreciate and be thankful for each other, for good health, and more importantly than even that is the God who created it all through Jesus Christ. Now I'm going to be referencing a story here of what happened in history, an accurate portrayal of what happened that led really to the beginning of these United States of America. And in one aspect, there's two tiers. There's Jamestown, 1607, and there is what happened with the Mayflower. And we today celebrate 405 years to recognize the Mayflower's landing at Plymouth Rock. Of course, a lot happened after that, and that is the story of Thanksgiving. And I'm going to be referencing this as originally authored by Rush Limbaugh III. The story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century. The Church of England under King James I was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize the Church's absolute civil and spiritual authority, which is actually the state. And a lot of that was sprouting forth from what happened over 100 years before with Henry VIII, who separated from the Catholic Church and formed his own brand, essentially, of church-led religion. And those who challenged ecclesiastical authority and those who believed strongly in freedom and worship were hunted down. And this is what England was like in the early 1600s. They were hunted down and imprisoned and sometimes executed for their beliefs. A group of separatists, people who didn't want any part of this, first fled to Holland. And essentially, they started their own community. They were there for 11 years, and those separatists who liked wooden shoes and cheese essentially agreed to make a perilous journey to the new world they had heard about. Some new, exciting place that hadn't been developed. They knew they would face hardships like you and I could not even conceive. And we don't know the hardship these people endured. There's no way we really can. We are way too advanced now with all those modern conveniences and technologies. People who lived in the 1600s would not believe life today. Try to explain flight and jet travel. Try to explain being able to communicate instantly, even via a rotary telephone. They wouldn't understand it. They knew they would face hardships, but paramount importance to them was living freely and worshiping God according to the dictates of their own conscience and their own beliefs. And the modern conveniences that they had at the time would all be wiped away. They would give all that up for a harsh landscape and disease and famine. That's what they were denied their freedom to do in England. On August the 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail. It carried a total of 102 passengers, including 40 of these separatists. Now, they were called pilgrims only much later in history. About 1841 is where that term first came to light. But before that, they were known as the separatists. And there were only 40 of them, and they were led by William Bradford on the journey across the Atlantic. And this is something that was really frightening and scary to sail across the sea at that time. The Mayflower was not much bigger than a 50-foot boat, and it had 102 people on it. You want to talk about being packed like sardines, and with all the provisions, what little there was in and amongst all of that. On the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, if you will, that established just and equal laws for all 40 members of the separatist community, irrespective of their religious beliefs. It didn't matter what their religious beliefs were. And these were the laws that were all agreed to live by. Where did the revolutionary ideas of these laws come from? It is the Mayflower Compact. That is what Bradford wrote. The Mayflower Compact derived from the Bible. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testament. And that is really what it is about. It is about this sustainers of life, and that is the way you do it. You need laws, and you need order, and you need equality. They were very devout religious people. No matter what else is said about them, they were devoutly religious. They looked to the ancient Israelites for the example. And because of the biblical precedent set forth in Scripture, they never doubted that their experiment would work. They never doubted they would get to the new world. They never doubted that once you got there, you would thrive. And that is a big deal, folks, because think about what they had to put up with, just sailing across the seas, of the number of different things that could have happened. It was all very treacherous at that point in time. It was a long, arduous journey, and it was dangerous. And when they finally landed, when the Pilgrims finally landed in New England in November of that same year, according to William Bradford's detailed journey, they found a cold, barren, desolate wilderness. Imagine New England as it exists today as nothing but rocks, forest, undeveloped nature in November and getting colder. By the way, they were intending to land in Virginia. They went way off track in much harsher conditions. There were no friends to greet them. There was no shelter of any kind other than hiding under a tree, where there was nothing, folks. It was desolate. There was no hotels, no inns, no places to clean up, no houses. It was real hardship. The sacrifice they had made for their freedom to worship was just beginning. During that first winter, during the first winter, half of them, including William Bradford's own wife, died of starvation, of sickness and exposure to the elements. Now we're getting close to what you were taught in school, where spring finally came. And by the way, writing that doesn't do it justice. Spring didn't just finally come. It was a survival. It was an act of survival that you and I cannot possibly relate to understand. The only people who really could be the special forces and the military, maybe the SEALs here in the United States, and they can have a glimpse of an understanding of what was going on. But I think even they probably couldn't conceive of it, because this is much more than just a training exercise, or this was their life. They were embedded in this. It was part of their existence. We've never done anything like this. That the first winter in the New World, they survived it. And after spring came, they met the Indians, the American Indians, who were there, who did help them in planting corn and fishing for cod. And this is what this means, because that's the sustainment of life. And this is what this piece here represents, the people of the dawn. The dawn meaning spring. And that's what was brought forth there as these pilgrims came and interacted here. And there's the image of the boat coming there as they landed on the beach, or on the near where the rock is. Pretty amazing. And so this is what they were. They helped them in planting corn, in fishing. They showed them where the beavers were, so that they could be skinned for coats and other things. But even with this degree of assistance from the Indians, there wasn't any prosperity yet. They had the Mayflower Compact. They had these laws that they were living by, but there was no prosperity. And you got to wonder why. It's important to understand, because this is where modern American history lessons end, with the Indians teaching the Pilgrims how to eat and how to fish and how to skin beavers. But that's where it ends, and that's the feel-good story. But that doesn't even get close to the true story of what happened for the Thanksgiving. It's actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives. It wasn't that. That happened, but Thanksgiving was a devout expression of gratitude, the Pilgrims to God for their survival and everything that was a part of it. The original contract the Pilgrims entered into Holland, they had sponsors that didn't have the money to do this trip on their own. And that there were merchant sponsors in London and Holland, and these merchant sponsors demanded that everything that the Pilgrims produced in the New World would go to a common store, a single bank, if you will, and that each member of the pilgrim community was entitled to one share of that store. So everybody had an equal share of whatever was in the bank. All of that land they cleared, all the houses they built belonged to that bank, to the community as well. And they were going to distribute it equally because they were going to be fair. So all of the land that they cleared and all the houses that they built belonged to everybody, belonged to the community, belonged to the bank, belonged to the common store. Nobody owned anything. They just had an equal share in it. It was a commune. Equality, right? Equality sounds like a good word, and in this case, really, it's a different word that's really kind of being used. Essentially, it's equitable, and that is really the real problem is. Equality is a very different thing when you think about it, but nonetheless, the Pilgrims established a commune, essentially, a forerunner to the communes we saw in the 60s and 70s out in California. They even had their own organic vegetables. And the Pilgrims, forerunners of organic vegetables, of course, what else could they have? There was no such thing as processed food back then. And so when you think about that, it's also what happened in the Bible, there in the book of Acts. There was a commune of sorts where Christians came together, but that was temporary, just for their travels. Now, William Bradford, who had become the governor of the colony, because he was the leader, recognized that this was not going to work. This was costly and destructive, and it just wasn't working. It was a collectivism. It was socialism, and it wasn't working. The first winter had taken a lot of lives, the manpower, and it was greatly reduced. So William Bradford decided to take bold action, and this is what happened here. We saw that all of this was not working. Essentially, the Mayflower Compact was a failed document, giving everybody a single share of stock in the common store, and the common bank was not working. It was collectivism. So Bradford decided to scrap it. He threw it out and took bold action. He assigned a plot of land to each family. Every family was given a plot of land. They could work it, manage it, however they wanted to. If they just wanted to sit on it and get fat, dumb, happy, and lazy, they could. If they wanted to develop it and they wanted to grow corn, whatever on it, they could. If they wanted to build on it, they could do that. If they wanted to turn it into a quasi-business, they could do whatever they wanted to do with it. And by the way, when he assigned it, essentially the land was just there, was sitting there. It was just an orderly way to be able to distribute the resources that they could pretty much take on their own because of what it was. And so he just kind of organized that, but that's really where it stopped. And that's kind of the system that we have here today in capitalism. Yes, there's government involvement to some extent. Of course, nowadays there's way too much government involvement, but the American ideal and what it makes American exceptionalism is what it is sort of that combination, but it much more heavily relies on the free market than not. And so he turned loose the power of the capitalist marketplace. And long before Karl Marx was even born, and so the Pilgrims had discovered and experimented with what could only be described as socialism, and they found that it didn't work. And it wasn't called that then, but that's exactly what it was. Everybody was given an equal share, and then nobody did anything. There was no incentive. Nothing worked. Nothing happened. So what Bradford and his community found was that the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anyone else unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation. But while most of the rest of the world has been experimenting with socialism for well over 100 and some odd years, trying to refine it, perfect it, and reinvent it, the Pilgrims decided early on to scrap it permanently. What Bradford wrote about the social experiment would be in every school child's history lesson. Or should be there. If it were, it might prevent much needless suffering if the true story of Thanksgiving had been taught for years and years. So William Bradford, after putting everybody in a common store, the Mayflower Compact, they wanted to be fair. They wanted everybody to have one common share of stock and everything. But then it bombed. There was no prosperity. There was no creativity because there was no incentive to create. So Bradford wrote about this failure. For this community was found to breed much confusion and discontent. They were not happy, in other words. This community was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. So in other words, nobody worked. And the way they set it up killed and discouraged work. For young men that were most able and fit for labor and service sat around and did nothing. They should spend their time and strength to work for others, men's wives and children, without being paid for it. Why should they do that? So they didn't. This was thought injustice. Why should you work for other people when you can't work for yourself? What's the point? Did you hear what he was saying, ladies and gentlemen? The Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without an incentive. So what did Bradford's community try next? They unharnessed the power of good old free enterprise by invoking capitalism. The principle of private property all the way back to the 1600s. It was incredible. Every family was assigned its own plot of land, and they could do with it whatever they wanted. They had very good success, wrote Bradford, for it made the hands of industrious, and so much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. So when profit was introduced, then the opportunity to prosper was introduced. It went gangbusters. And that's the essence of the true story of Thanksgiving. And this is where it really gets good, and is that they had abundance. So they set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians. After they had enjoyed this prosperity, it was not the Indians that brought them to prosperity. It was not said to insult anybody, but the Indians assisted in their arrival undeniably. But what led to prosperity for the original settlers was a common store fail, that socialism didn't work. They introduced themselves to the free enterprise. They didn't have the name for it, but when they turned loose individual incentive, keep what you produce, sell what you don't need, it went crazy. This is not something they were taught by anybody, by self-experience. It was not the Indians. None of this. This is really what is happening here. It was their own recognition of the free enterprise and capitalism. The Indians did a lot of things that helped them, and that was very good. The success of the colony after they had abandoned socialism and tried was essentially capitalism. And then it led to abundance, and then led to that first Thanksgiving where they invited the Indians to enjoy the fruits of the labor, where they all came together and recognized and be very thankful that they survived that winter. And that happened in 1621. It was a tremendous harvest that year, and that's the big gathering that is taught in history books. The native Indians and the Pilgrims joined together for a huge feast, which is the foundational story of the Thanksgiving that's been taught in schools. But what's behind all of that is recognizing the free enterprise system and hard work, and that is why we enjoy Thanksgiving today. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I want to wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below, and I want to encourage you to please rate, share, comment, and subscribe.